thank you, Sariya, Jamie, for this interview of your amazing book that you've edited, Muslim Women in Britain, and it's 1850 to 1950. So I have read most of the book, and I've got some questions for you. So let's start. And I guess my first thing is not really about the book, but could be, but it was more about you, Sariya. So when I was doing a bit of research, I saw that you refer to yourself as a feminist sociologist of religion. So I wanted to know what that means. So yeah, so let's start off with that.
Okay, so the sociology of religion is the study of how religion is lived in families, in communities, each and in that sense it becomes really diverse, really decentered. Each individual, would negotiate with their faith and live it in a way that while remaining true to the texts on the one hand also becomes their also becomes a reflection of their personal relationship with God, with their belief system. And that's what the sociology of religion studies. So
Mhm.
how do individuals, communities, families, how do they live their faith in their lives? And a very simple example would be the clothes, for example, that people wear. The American sociologist of Islam, John Esposito, talks about not one Islam, but many Islams. And he doesn't mean something heretical. All he means is in each different culture, Islam is slightly different. So, the Indonesian form of modest clothing is very brightly colored. It's
Yes.
a two-piece outfit for women. You go to Saudi Arabia, it's often black, not always. You go to Pakistan, it's the salwar kameez. They're all modest forms of clothing, but they're all a reflection of the culture
Yes.
of that area, of those people. So that's what sociology of Islam is.
Mhm.
And bringing the feminist angle to it, um, feminism insists, my version of feminism insists on hearing lesser heard voices, people at
Okay.
the margins, minorities, minoritized groups. So I'm very interested in the voices of women, of children, of lesser heard groups when it comes to lived experiences of religion. So that's what a feminist sociologist of religion, well,
Yeah.
does,
Yeah,
means.
it kind of explains like the narrative of the book as well. Now I get what you mean. And I guess, one of the first obvious questions would be what motivated you to, both of you, to create this book, and why did you choose this time period, so pre-1900s, and in terms of research, collecting that data, evidence, what was that starting point? What was those conversations? Jamie, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think let me think. So I think although we argue that the stories and the people's lives in this book do have resonance for today, it is a history book. And our aim was to kind of bring lost stories and hidden voices to the fore. And as we say in the kind of introduction, in order to build a better picture of British history as a whole, but also the history of Islam and Muslims in Britain, which so far has tended to focus on men whose lives tend to be better documented. I mean, that said, the history of Islam in Britain, as you all know, is a pretty new subject area. I mean, it's only really this century that it's taken off. And there are many more scholars and non-scholars who are working on the history of Islam in Britain. So there's a lot of work to do, and this was our starting point, I would say.
Soria, do you want to add anything?
Oh, no, I think I'll echo what Jamie just said. Um, and particularly as a Muslim woman living in Britain, I was really pleased when I saw histories of British Muslim communities beginning to emerge. It started about a decade ago. There was work before that, but I think the last decade has seen like a rush of books, including Jamie's work. Jamie, what's the name of your book? I remember it well.
Loyal Enemies.
Loyal Enemies, yeah, Jamie's book Loyal Enemies, which is fascinating, and which sort of started my historical journey, my journey of historical exploration, really. But when I looked at these books, I felt women weren't represented enough. Um, it was almost like a bit of a intellectual calling for me to uncover what these women were doing in those communities, who they were. And I think the stories we found are quite amazing. I mean, this book was precluded by a journal article that I wrote. I'm going to say 2020 in the journal Religions, that looked at Muslim women in Britain's first mosques. And in that was the first ever piece of work. It was funded by the British Academy. I'm very grateful to them. And what I uncovered was, and I write about it in that journal article, that Muslim women did not, simply exist in these mosque communities. They were very much an integral part of these communities' everyday fabric. They were leaders in these mosques. We know Fatima Cates was the co-founder of the first mosque, the founding treasurer. That was her specific designation. So founding treasurer of the first mosque in Liverpool. And we also know that Begum Shah Jahan funded the first mosque, the first purpose-built mosque in Woking. So women were not just, people who existed in these mosques. They were key to its fabric, and they led these communities. And having uncovered those stories, both me and Jamie, realized there was so much more to be done. We've uncovered 5 or 6 stories, maybe 9, 10 stories in these books. Lots of other women who, are part. There are chapters in this book that deal with more than one woman, but there are so many more to be uncovered. And so I echo James when he says, this is a beginning.
I mean, I think for me also, going on what Sariya was saying, for me it's an extension or a progression in terms of my work, especially in terms of converts to Islam. And early on I did do a lot of research on Lady Evelyn Cobbold, for example. But she was one of the few in that first book, Loyal Enemies, who I kind of focused on in any great detail. And many of the women I did come across, I just knew by name. And I still don't know just by name, actually, because most of them we know so little about. So for me, it's a kind of continuity of research, but building a much bigger picture of women's lives in that history.
Yeah, and I think just, when I was reading the book, there was, you were quite honest about gaps in history. For example, Cade, like her story was needed to be told, but there was gaps in that history and not knowing, what happened in between, and then kind of using the knowledge and the information that you have about their character and then actually filling in those gaps, I guess. So how frustrating was that when you're compiling a book in terms of history of Muslim women in Britain, where there are gaps, because that must be really frustrating, because you don't know whether you've missed it in your research, or is it something that actually they're just not visible, in that narrative.
I mean, if I can say so, I mean, as a subject as a whole, I mean, what we do say, I think we're quite explicit. We say this is just a starting point. That there are lots of gaps still, and we're not. The aim of this book is not to kind of to create a full history at all. It's kind of 10 snapshots of Muslim women's lives, some groups of Muslim women and some individual Muslim women, converts and born Muslims. So the gaps are there. It is frustrating. There's no way around it. But I think we decided that the best approach was to start this with a kind of edited collection, bringing together 11 scholars to produce 10 chapters. And we hope that we can build on that, and other people will be inspired to build on that too.
Yeah. What was the time frame in terms of, when you were talking about those initial ideas and the conception to the publication date? How long did all that take? How years?
I think so my article came out in 2020.
Yeah.
And Jamie got in touch sort of within a few, quite shortly after. I'd say towards the end of 2020, that's when we sort of decided, right,
Yeah.
we're going to address this gap. We're going to do a book. And it's taken us till, well, November 2023, the book came out.
Yeah.
So nearly 3 years. I mean,
Amazing.
each, so firstly, there was a bit of research that Jamie and me had to do in relation to who could contribute to this book. There was no way that the two of us could sit down and write this book on our own, because the resources, like you said, Shameem, they're really, really sparse. There are gaps in them. As a sociologist, I get really frustrated because historical work takes much longer in my mind, much longer. The source, you have to go through the archives. You can't do a word search. So we first had to do a bit of research saying to explore who could actually contribute to our book. Both of us wanted to write in it, but what was it, that we would write about in this book? But once you've identified these people, and you will see um, from the book, there are people here, there are people from America. That was a bit of an ask. Some people who've been researching in this field are now, semi-retired or too busy, and they had to opt out. But once we'd identified the people, then all these people had to go out and do
Yes.
their research. So
Yeah.
there was a good solid year when they were doing their research and writing their books, writing the book. So, and writing their pieces in the book. So yeah, good 3 years, isn't it, Jamie?
Yeah.
It is, and during that time, well, in the first year, we were kind of, I think you may have asked about the periodization in your first question. We were kind of debating where to start the book. And we kind of were thinking originally of going back further, but decided on the century from around 1850. I mean, it's not, I mean, the book title is 1850, though actually it's kind of there's some leeway there. But we eventually settled after a few months on 1850 to 1950.
A span of like 100 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, the 19th century, or the second half, is a really pivotal time for the development of Islam in Britain.
Yeah.
So we wanted to push ourselves and our contributors. We knew it's not an easy task to go back into the 19th century with these kind of more marginal lives, but we wanted to see what could be found. We've come up with a few interesting case studies.
I think like it's evident when you're reading this as a reader, it's evident the amount of research that's gone into it, and you kind of forgive the gaps, and so you know that you've exhausted all resources. It feels like it's as comprehensive as it can be, for that. So how was it once you released the book in November, and the reception following the release? Was it what you expected? I mean, how was that? Sariya, you're smiling.
You write an academic book, right? And it goes, libraries buy them, academics get interested. But I think Jamie will agree with me, this book has been quite different in terms of how people received it. We purposely went with Hearst. We chose Hearst as a publisher, A, because they do history work, B, because their price points aren't crazy. The book costs about 30 money, but it isn't beyond the reach of, ordinary. It isn't beyond the reach of people in communities and community libraries. So that was why we went with Hearst. Now, within a few weeks of the book coming out, you all contacted us, and I think Jamie will agree when I say this. We are absolutely delighted that Muslim Women's Network UK has contacted us, because as we were writing the book, when I have spoken at events about the history of Muslim women in Britain, I have come away completely moved by the ability of the stories in this book to inspire, inspire Muslim women, inspire Muslims, inspire anybody, irrespective of ethnicity or religion. So you coming to us, we are ever so grateful, because we hope you can, take this book
Yeah,
to Muslim female Muslim communities. But we've also had the BBC interested, the Morning Star reviewed
brilliant.
our book favorably. And Jamie, I don't know whether you've noticed, we actually have an 5-star Amazon review of
Oh,
our
really?
book. Yes.
That's a first for
So
me.
Oh,
I
that's
think it's the second
amazing.
Amazon review I've received. But I think our strategy of going with Hearst, making it accessible, I think that's paid off.
Yeah, I
And
think that was a
actually
smart move. Yeah.
and these stories, they stand on their own in
Yeah.
terms of their ability to inspire.
Yeah, and I think I underestimated that level of inspiration that I would get, and I was like, oh my God, back then they did this, like they were empowered, and it's shocking, but not when you kind of think, why is it that it's taken this long? Because I think the general kind of consensus in the Western world, Western media isn't exactly positive. It's very like, oh, you're oppressed, you're controlled and so on. But I know I'll kind of cover that later on, so I'm trying not to get ahead of myself. So next question. So I noticed that Muslim women who were born into the religion was harder to identify in research. Do you think it's because that they weren't present in Britain, or was it that they were invisible? And can we get a true picture of what Islam was like in Britain for British Muslim women through the lens of reverts?
Jamie, do you want to do it or shall I do it?
Well, we can do it together. We've done everything together so far. I mean, the first point is that there were born Muslim women in Britain throughout this period and much, much earlier. And we'd like to go back much earlier in some future work, which maybe we'll talk about later. Certainly in the 17th century and maybe 16th. I don't know. I'm not an expert in early modern history, but we know that there were Muslim women in Britain in that period. And they were there as immigrants and workers and visitors and later as students. But their lives, especially the working class women, are really, really poorly documented, even in the 1850, 1950 period. So there's some good examples of ayahs or nannies from South Asia, some of whom were Muslim, many weren't, but some were, and we simply know them by their names and nothing more at this point. I mean, hopefully other people may be working on these interesting women. And Siobhan and Daniel in our book, they located accounts written by South Asian Muslim women who were born overseas, but visited Britain. They were generally middle and upper middle class and upper class women who were educated and literate and privileged, which meant that they wrote about their lives and they documented them, often in a diary or a travelogue, not necessarily in English, but they were translated and their accounts have survived. So we do have some source material. But they are difficult, to go back to your question directly, they are difficult to identify and difficult to research. More so than the converts. And so far in British Muslim history, converts have tended to dominate the narratives because there does seem to be better records of them through the various societies that they joined. I should say reverts isn't a term that I don't think, I may be wrong, but I don't think it was ever used by converts in the period that we're talking about.
I think reverts is the word that we're using now. So when you said
Sure.
converts, I was going to write converts and reverts because, but
Yeah,
it
sure.
used to be converts was the late.
Sure. So I personally don't tend to use it in historical work because it has all sorts of assumptions that I don't think the subjects that I'm working on may have had. They may have done, but we don't know because they didn't use the term. But I'm getting into the kind of minutiae here, but and away from your question. There was something you asked about converts that I forgot.
Just in terms of whether it's a true picture of Islam for British Muslim women through the lens of converts, sorry, rather than born Muslim women.
So I think there were the 60s and the 70s were a massive shift, a massive change in the demographics and the context of Muslims in Britain. So prior to the 1950s, 60s, the Muslim community in Britain tended to not, and this is a generalization, so, you know, take it with a pinch of salt. They tended to be convert communities, you know, end of the 1900s, we know they existed around Woking and around Liverpool. There were transient communities, so sailors who came and went,
Yeah.
their families. There were born Muslims, I'm sure there would have, but there wouldn't have been, there would have really been these travelers. And like Jamie was saying, you know, we've covered these women in the chapter that Siobhan and Daniel have written. You know, Noor Inayat Khan, famous born Muslim, we know a lot about her. But the others would have been fewer, and they would have been spread out. So, you know, it's a challenge. It is, remains a challenge. And, you know, with the working class women who would have had perhaps daughters who were born Muslim, quote unquote, they too, you know, these were working class women, and if you're struggling for food and you don't know whether when the next paycheck is coming, you're not really going to think about preserving, you know, your heritage and preserving your paperwork. You probably won't have the resources to do so. So those are the challenges we grapple with. And so there will be gaps in the retelling of history, and we're very aware of them.
Yeah.
In terms of your question of true picture, I don't know what a true picture looks like. But what I would say is that we look at the spectrum of Muslim women and Muslim women's lives in Britain in the past, and there's no simple narrative.
No.
So I don't know what the true picture would be. We look at converts, reverts, we look at born Muslims, we see shared experiences, and we see differences. But there is your general, I think the general point you're making, which I do agree with, is that the so-called born Muslims, we know less about them at this point in time, for sure.
So the next question, I guess, is more for you, Sariya, in terms of your personal journey in finding Islam and how much that would have influenced the research, and how you viewed these Muslim women. Could you identify with them?
Gosh, that's a big question. Yes. So I'm a convert to Islam. You know, I'm a trustee for the Convert Muslim Foundation UK, so that I guess that makes me a British convert to Islam, although I converted in India.
You'll be there, part of that history as well.
Yes. I'm part of their history. I was born Catholic, so, you know, the wider Christian context that a lot of the women in this book came from. Now, you asked me about, you know, my sort of personal journey and what this meant. So since I've been, my PhD all those years ago, Shameem, was a giving a voice to Muslim women in Britain. The way it ended up, the way I did the field work, it ended up being contemporary, you know, Muslim women in and around educational institutions. And that piece of work was all about demystifying Muslim women, about positioning them as human beings. And I remember there was a really powerful quote from a young woman, actually from Birmingham, that I used in that book. And she says, you know, why, when you approach me, you treat me, you know, as an alien, as something different. I'm actually just a woman. I feel and I love and I cry and I hate. And you know, that was what that book was about. And in some ways, this book is about that as well. You know, we are not pillar boxes, you know, we are not whatever. We are human beings. We laugh, we smile, we cry. You know, Olive Salaman sat in the bomb shelter fearing for her life with her children. You know, Fatima Hanem, who, you know, was this woman who was cheated by an Indian trickster, but ends up making a life for herself nevertheless. And Noor Inayat Khan, who, you know, gave her life for country. So these are women. These are women like any other women. These are women who love their homeland. And these are women who just want to be portrayed as women. And so my work, a lot of my work You asked me about the feminism, you asked me about the sociology of religion. It is about demystifying, it is about dismantling bridges. It's not that we are not different, we are different. Our faith gives us particular characteristics. We don't do Sunday Mass, we might go to Jummah prayers instead. But in terms of our lived realities, in terms of wanting food and loving our children and caring for our partners, that's quite similar. And I think this is where this book comes from as well.
What was the most surprising discovery you made whilst compiling the book?
Oh dear. Jamie, that's for you. You do that.
It's a simple question. It's quite heavy.
Well, no, I mean, for me, what surprises me, and it surprised me for 20 odd years that I've been working on the history of Islam in Britain, but specifically in relation to this, is the variety of women that we and our contributors have uncovered, and from all sorts of backgrounds, with often really different experiences and motivations, different ways of being Muslim in Britain, different ambitions, different legacies. But I mean, I have to say, pretty much all of them, for me, I'm really struck by their agency and their tenacity, despite of or because of the kind of depressingly consistent level of hostility towards them, stories of hardship and struggle. I'd like to say that there wasn't a lot of struggle and hardship, but that really resonates across many of these women's lives. So that surprises me. Doesn't surprise me in some respects, but their agency and tenacity does. I mean, I think these are impressive women from all walks of life, and I think our contributors did a great job in uncovering aspects of their stories.
What surprised me? So I have a really silly story, right? And it shows I think it demonstrates my own naivety as well. So I was watching the new version of Around the World in 80 Days. I was basically watching it because the Doctor Who guy was the main actor, and what's his name? I forget.
David Tennant.
Yes, David Tennant. David Tennant. I think David Tennant is really cute. He has been in the next room, so I better be quiet. No, but I think he's a really good actor. That's the mature way of saying it. And then series 2, 3, this woman appears on a camel, in full Muslim garb. Really seems really cool. Seems really strong. Fast forward to a few months later, I was in a thing, in some sort of conference, and somebody mentions her because everybody's been watching Around the World in 80 Days. And I'm like, nah, she can't be real. She couldn't have been. She turned out to be Jane Digby, really existed. We've been hinting at future direction. So I think one future direction would be to really rewrite her story, because I was simply surprised that she actually existed, and that the BBC researchers were so good that they managed to weave her into this story. But after I found out she was real, I started reading the biographies that have been written about her, and they don't present her in very good light at all. She's this charlatan woman, this woman who is really of loose character. So I think there's a job to recover her story.
Definitely, yeah. I did the same thing. I was like, is she real? Yeah, brilliant. So I guess this is my favorite question. So like my favorite Muslim woman was Sultan Jahan, which I was surprised that she was my first, but I just loved her creativity and how she used further as a vehicle for female empowerment. I just thought it was brilliant for that time. I thought she was well ahead. So I guess, who is your favorite Muslim woman that's featured in the book, and why? So whoever wants to go first. Jamie, you're not on mute, so if you want to go first.
Okay. My diplomatic answer is I wouldn't single out one. I think each of them offers something new to the history of Islam in Britain. And I think they make an interesting group of people. But, I do have soft spots. I have two soft spots in particular. One is for obviously the subject of the chapter I wrote about, because I spent 3 years thinking about her. She's called Gladys Brooke, and she married into the Brooke family. Sarawak, the kind of hereditary rulers, British rulers of Sarawak. But I actually, and I found a lot of material about her. So she's an example of where there was actually quite a lot of material, but almost nobody had written anything substantial about her, which kind of still strikes me now as being odd, but it is what it is. But I like her because of that, again, this idea of her tenacity. She defied the conventions of her class and privilege, and many voices who criticized her and belittled her and dismissed her as a crank, and they didn't really think that she was a genuine Muslim, if we can use that kind of term. But she did. She wrote about Islam, and she ultimately remained a Muslim for the rest of her life and was buried a Muslim in Sri Lanka. So I have a soft spot for her. And then conversely, I have a soft spot for someone called Bertha Cave.
Yes.
Who's totally different to Gladys Brooks. She's from a working class background, and I think she's really important to British history, actually, for all sorts of reasons. But we know almost nothing about her. And her story, like so many others, just raises so many questions, and many more than we can currently answer. So we know that she converted to Islam before her marriage, but we know almost nothing about why she chose Islam, even how she converted, and if she practiced her faith in England or when she moved to India, or why she later converted back to Christian. There were so many questions, so I'm really interested in her. I have some spot for her. But all of the women, I mean, pretty much all fascinate me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll go with the diplomatic answer. No,
It's like asking a parent, which child is it? Tell us.
it's really hard because, you know, I remember sitting down when we were editing this book, and, you know, you read through all the chapters, and all of them are so strong. You know, all of them have, and, you know, the aspects of these women's personalities would resonate with women today in different ways, different aspects. So, you know, you've got the aristocratic Lady Evelyn Cobbold. She's in our book, although she doesn't have a chapter. You know, her love of Scotland, right? Her love of Scotland. I know there's nothing is that Islamic. Well, Scotland is a beautiful place. And she writes about it, and she loves the estate, you know, there where she died ultimately, and where she was buried in Glenaig. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. You know, north of Inverness. I just like, you know, her verve. She was feisty. I was reading the autobiography she wrote of her Hajj that was best selling. And in that she has a novel with her, right? As she's performing the Hajj. She's probably on her way to Arafat, which is one of the, you know, rituals of the Hajj. And an Arab sees the book, this novel next to her, and says, you should only be reading the Quran. You know, why do you have this novel with you? And I'm paraphrasing her, and she gets quite cross and says, I am English. You know, we do things our way. But throughout her life, despite this, you know, and with this Englishness, there's a sense of devout commitment to her faith, which I actually, you know, understand, recognize in my own life. And Jamie used the term soft spots. I mean, I certainly have a soft spot for Olive Salaman, whom I wrote about. You know, she's born 1920s. 1930, she falls in love with a Yemeni sailor, marries him against the wishes of her family, of her community. He too actually marries her against the wishes of his community. And you know, strong love and all of that. I'm a romantic at heart. So all of these stories in different ways show the myriad, the galaxies of ways in which it is possible to be a Muslim woman. And so in that regards, I must say I love all of them. Cop out, but I've given you two soft spots.
Yeah. No, good answers, both of you.
I mean, I would say that if people are wondering why there isn't a chapter on Lady Evelyn Cobbold, who I also have a soft spot for, I should say, it's because we set ourselves the challenge early on to kind of not kind of do a rehash of the little we did know or people did know at the time of writing. So a few people have written, people, our contributors, have subsequently published other things about their subjects. So we didn't want to add, we didn't think there was much new to say about Lady Evelyn Cobbold, so we don't have a chapter about her.
Yeah, because you do get glimpses of other kind of women in the book. It could be maybe a future kind of you know, story around them if there is that information available. But yeah, and I like the way how some characters weave in and out of other people's stories as well. The one I can think of is it Gilham? There we go. He like, it wasn't, although there's no chapter on him, he's kind of weaved into the story a couple.
So Abdullah Quilliam was a
Yes.
convert, right? And he establishes what was perhaps the first mosque. I mean, there will be stuff we don't know about, but for now we can agree his was the first mosque in Liverpool. 1893, I think. Jamie will correct me in a minute if I'm wrong. But what happened around this mosque is, because of the force of his character, he was somebody who was, you know, people looked up to him. He was charismatic. And I think, and he was appointed by the Ottoman Sultan as the Sheikh ul-Islam of the British Isles, the first and perhaps only Sheikh ul-Islam of the British Isles. So there was this force of character, and because of that, there was a community that evolved around him. We know the Badshah of Afghanistan comes to London, right? Visits the Queen, dines in Windsor, and then makes the journey to Liverpool because he also wants to meet the Sheikh ul-Islam of the British Isles. So you can see the force of character. And what you see is, you know, he produced for his community. He's quite an organized man, I think. I don't know, but there was a newsletter, a community newsletter that emerged, that was published every week. And that is an invaluable resource for historians like me and Jamie. There were other so he also published a journal, but the journal is more formal writing. There was a journal that came out of the mosque in Woking as well. That was formal writing, but this weekly record of life in the Liverpool Muslim Institute, which was what his mosque is called, is extremely useful. And it is from within that these stories and narratives of women come out. And so you've got Fatima Cates, who, as I mentioned before, founding treasurer, really, really active. We also have Nafisa Keep. She comes over from America. Quite, I'll say, a flowery character. I won't say much. People can read the book. But comes here and is, you know, takes on quite a visible leadership role. You know, she's helping Quilliam with some of the political activism they do. She's at least named as the leader of a big sort of madrasa that they set up. She's giving lectures around women living under Muslim laws and whatnot. So that's how you find this overlap. There are other women, you know, from that community. People want to write about Quilliam's mum, for example, who also converted to Islam. But I think that's why you see that overlap there around women who emerged from his community. And he himself is a, you know, really important character for British Muslim history. And there are books about him, Ron Jeeves' book. Yeah, but he didn't fit in our book because he wasn't a woman.
No, we could do another book about him. Well, I think there was all, Jamie, have you written about him before, haven't you?
I think most of it, he was such a central figure for quite a long time that he just crops up everywhere from 1880s right through to 1930s. He changed his identity in that period. He's a polymath. Everywhere.
I want to point, you know, Sultan Jan, what struck me is not just the example of Sultan Jan when you use, but generally, you know, the things that Muslim women were fighting for back then, we're still fighting for them now. So, for example, Sultan Jahan, she was very well versed in terms of Islam and like especially around nikah marriages, and she, she knows about the contracts that you can put clauses in. And one of the things that we found on the Muslim Women's Helpline when women ring us and we ask them about their marital status, nearly a quarter of them know little about the Islamic rights on nikah. So, I guess why do you think we're still fighting for these causes and these causes, but also knowledge and educating Muslim women about their rights?
That's a very big question,
Mm.
Shameem. Very big question. I think about this question a lot because, it's been the subject of a lot of my research. But it's generally it is something that we need to talk about more. But I've wondered about this gap. Um, and I'm going to go away briefly from this book, but and talk about generally around Muslim women's historical intellectual contributions. So Akram Nadwi, Aisha Bewley, these are people who've sort of looked at this history. Akram Nadwi has compiled a list of muhaddithat, which is basically um, female scholars of hadith, and it ended up being, I think, a huge 30-volume book, and he only translated the first introductory volume into English. Great book, very difficult to read. Aisha Bewley, on the other hand, has written a really small, thin booklet, and it's about, I can't remember what the title is, but it's about women in social, political, educational leadership, and both of them talk about how Muslim women in these visible socio-political roles, intellectual roles, they were throughout history, they've since, the emergence of Islam in Arabia, 1400 years ago, women were quite central. And then 300 years ago, the numbers of women in these sort of visible public political roles kind of drop off. Various reasons. Some people talk about colonialism and how, suddenly, because of colonialism, Muslim women became things that had to be protected. The men had to protect women from the colonial invader, and in doing so, it went. Those attitudes have then stayed with us. There is enduring patriarchy. There is Western patriarchy that is a completely different flavor to Eastern patriarchies, and all of these have come together. And even to date, the increased, the far, the disproportional scrutiny that Muslim women face in terms of all sorts of things, faith choices, work choices, sartorial choices, that is a lot of pressure. And so, in that sense, maybe in some ways, Muslim women are limiting, and it's all of these stimuli, internal, external, personal, that are coming together and contesting the scrutiny that Muslim women face is really hard, and that is only increasing, as time passes. The way to challenge it is through people like me and Jamie writing books like this that highlight women's contributions to society. There is theological work to be done, highlighting the central roles that women like Aisha, Fatima, Khadija, may Allah be pleased with them all, played in that evolutionary period of Islam. Our Prophet, may peace be upon him, drew heavily on the women in his lives.
Yes, he did.
For inspiration, for guidance, for support. That needs to be spoken about a lot more.
Yeah.
And we, as women, we need to educate ourselves about our faith and the rights it provides.
Yeah, and I think this book, for me, it was an eye opener, but it just, you kind of realize that the picture is so much bigger. There were women back in 1850 and earlier who were, formidable, who wanted to kind of change that. And we're still kind of, the advantage we have maybe is social media, and we have like the world at our fingertips, and we can do this. And I guess in terms of you know, the book and the impact, a hopefully positive impact it has on Muslim women, but other people as well. How do you see this book as in terms of the positive impact, but also in terms of final kind of comments about you know, where do you see yourself in terms of researching Muslim women post 1950 and onwards?
So we've done 1850 to 1950. Some of the work that I've previously done, so Muslim Women in Britain, Demystifying the Muslimah, that book kind of covers contemporary Muslim women. One thing I'm really interested in doing is that middle period, you know, women who came here as migrants. Again, the text sort of dismissed them, just like the text dismissed the Yemeni women of the early 1900s, you know, dismissed them as sort of, you know, oppressed, don't know, forced to convert. The women who came here as migrants, 1850s, 1950s, 1960s, forgive me, they are dismissed, they're kind of voiceless, we don't know much about them. But anecdotally, you know, I hear some amazing stories. Somebody told me about how his mom decided she was going to run a fish and chip shop in Birmingham, the first ever by a Muslim woman, he says. And the fish and chip shop was close to a football stadium. So his mom had some really, really amazing conversations with football fans. So I don't think these women were oppressed. I think they'd be amazing stories around how they supported their husbands to forge careers. A lot of these women were in charge of cultural transmission within their families. And I think so I'm quite keen to capture those stories. Another thing we've spoken about, me and Jamie, was pre-1850s. And also Britain was different. It wasn't Britain, the island. It was the British Empire. So do you then expand? And that could go crazy. That could go crazy because it will just be such a huge geographical scope. But Jamie, I've spoken enough now. It's your turn.
I can't remember all of the question, but I know the beginning of the question was about how the book can positively impact. I think
let's go with that.
hopefully our book can show women's lives and agency in the history of Britain and the history of Islam in Britain and their contributions to our society. So that's our aim, and I hope we've done that. We just need to get the book out there and people to read it, whether they read the book or they read extracts or they read the press. So that's why we're so grateful that you're doing this interview.
We're grateful that you guys have agreed. I was super excited.
Yeah.
And then, so I've completely forgotten the question.
I mean, I'll jump in then while Jamie remembers. So if we are to understand the history of Britain in its entirety, then it is paramount that we understand everybody's contributions, you know, particularly the contributions of those who are at the margins, you know, minoritized groups, Black groups, South Asian groups, and certainly women. And that's the space. If we are to understand who we are as Britons today, you know, Muslim women are part of that story as well.
Yeah, and I think although we you know, we're the first to say that we're looking at a very different historical context, that there are common issues of sexism, racism, class, religion, all sorts of isms that do cut across time and history. So we hope that our book can shed light on those, so shed light on the past and think about the present and the future. In terms of future work, I think Sariya summed it up pretty neatly. We want to do everything, really.
Rule the world.
Why not? Yes.
But I think a more coherent history would be amazing if we could maybe start it a bit earlier and bring it more up towards the end of the 20th century. I'm not sure about beyond, but that'll be amazing. But it will take a lot of time and research. So that's why I think we're quite content to try and do small bits and pieces initially. And as I said earlier, we hope that other people will take on this challenge as well. It's not down to us.
Mm.
To do
Yeah,
this
we
work.
want to inspire the next generation of, historical scholars
Mm.
to pick up this book, to pick up some of the stories that are told in it, but also those gaps that you identified, Shameem. They
Yes.
can, we'd be very grateful if they could start unpicking, unraveling
Yeah.
those gaps. We've got Jane Digby in there. We've only got a little paragraph about her at the end. Somebody needs to pick up her story and run with it.
Yeah.
I've got Olive Salaman in there, but there were
Mm.
other women who converted to Islam in those working class communities. Find them, tell their stories.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sariya and Jamie, for your time, and it's been a pleasure